Slave owners in South Carolina, heavily outnumbered by their coerced black workforce, as you can see from this graph, had long dreaded a slave revolt, and in 1739 their nightmares came true. That September, 60 of the colony's rebels, led by a man named Jemmy, beat a murderous path southwards towards Spanish Florida, killing whites and burning property along the way. It began innocently enough, before dawn on a Sunday, when Jemmy and 19 other enslaved men, many of them Congolese, many of them former soldiers, pulled up at a country store on the banks of the Stono River, just 20 miles from Charlestown, the colony's capital city. They were members of a ditch-digging crew. They were hungry, exhausted, completely disgruntled by the work they'd been doing, and the talk among them was of running away, en masse. They broke into the store that night looking for food and drink, probably liquor. But two drunk white men, one of whom was the night watchman for the store, were already inside. And when they detected this unfolding burglary, a fight broke out. Things got out of hand, and the ditch diggers killed both of the white men inside the store. Knowing that they would swing for these killings if they were caught, the ditch diggers now fled with the guns and gunpowder inside the store. It took them a while to figure out what to do next. Their options were limited. In the end, they chose not to burn the store or to fire their guns into the air to summon other slaves. In fact, they headed north, looking for a creek or river and a craft they might pilot out into the ocean. But they found nothing, and so eventually turned around, proceeding south along Pon Pon Road, having heard, perhaps from Spanish spies sent to Carolina to foment just this sort of domestic insurrection, that slaves who ran away from English plantations would be welcomed as heroes across the border in St. Augustine, the capital city of Florida. That border was many miles further south, and so the ditch diggers seemed to have reached the desperate conclusion that their only hopes of getting there alive was with help. So rather than running, they slowed their pace to march, raised a makeshift flag, beat two drums they'd somehow acquired, and began to chant "Liberty, liberty," in hopes that other slaves would hear them and choose to join them, and that together they could build some sort of army strong enough to be allowed to pass out of South Carolina and across the Spanish border into Spanish Florida. And it almost worked. Their numbers did grow, first to 60, then to about 80. Not as many as these accidental rebels surely hoped for, but still a terrifying prospect to all the plantation owners in their path. Over that first 24 hours, these desperate slaves burned 7 plantations and killed 25 white men, women, and children. Local Carolina planters were petrified and wasted no time assembling local militia to strike back and stop what to them seemed like an armed revolt. This poorly trained but supremely well-armed militia force ambushed the Stono slave rebels at their campsite on the second day of the Stono uprising. 30 rebels quickly fled into the woods in hopes of returning to their plantations before their masters noted their absence. Others stood their ground, one even engaging his own master in a firefight. The rebel slave discharged his pistol first, but it misfired. His unscathed master now took careful aim and shot this man through the head. The majority of the slave rebels were killed in this melee, many after having already surrendered to this white militia. A few of the survivors were pardoned, but most, of course, were not. To terrify and deter the colony's remaining slave population from ever emulating these Stono rebels, the militiamen cut off several rebels' heads and spiked them on posts, one every mile, between the site of the skirmish and Charlestown. The 30 rebels who had managed to flee now became prey in a massive manhunt, and they too were soon captured and killed. Those final brutal massacres put an end to the 1739 Stono Rebellion. The next spring, the South Carolina General Assembly overhauled its slave code to try to prevent any future insurrection in this black majority colony. Their new 1740 Negro Act was premised upon the idea that slaveholders' strength resided in their unity. Thus, it dramatically restricted the freedoms that some masters had previously granted their slaves. From now on, it was illegal for masters to teach their slaves to read, or to give them their legal freedom, a practice known as manumission. The 1740 Negro Act barred slaves from carrying firearms, from purchasing liquor, and from leaving their plantation without a written pass signed by their master. Significantly, it also prohibited slaves from owning wooden swords and other dangerous weapons, or using or keeping of drums, horns, or other loud instruments that might be used by would-be rebels to recruit during an insurrection. The same act also limited the workday to 15 hours in summer and fewer in winter, and decreed that all slaves be granted a day of rest each Sunday. According to historian Herbert Aptheker, the 1739 Stono Rebellion was the bloodiest, by far, of perhaps as many as 250 slave uprisings or conspiracies in British North America and the United States. Every colony and state, Aptheker argues, experienced multiple insurrections in which at least 10 slaves plotted or enacted schemes to achieve their freedom by force of arms. Now, unfortunately, evidence of the existence of some of these plots is decidedly fragmentary, often coming down to us via a single entry in a single planter's diary or a half sentence in a legal document. The weaknesses of this documentary record suggest that most of these plots had decidedly limited impact. Indeed, all but a tiny fraction of these plots were discovered and brutally suppressed before their masterminds could gain access to arms or draw the first blood. Some were likely not even conspiracies at all, but simply dark fantasies conjured in the paranoid minds of terrified slaveholders who saw conspiracies everywhere. Indeed, if we limit ourselves strictly to the study of plots in which slave rebels actually managed to initiate their plans in some substantive way before reprisals against them commenced, then Stono, in 1739, stands alone as the only significant armed challenge to slaveholders' supremacy before the 19th century. Seen in those terms, one might ask why so many plots failed, and why there were not more slave revolts on the scale of Stono. The historian David Geggus, who has made a career of searching for patterns among slave revolts not just in North America but across the New World, argues that insurrections on the same scale as Stono typically occurred in the New World in particular circumstances, namely the following. First, they occurred on large plantations in which 100 or more enslaved people lived or worked. Second, on plantations in which high proportions of enslaved people had been recently enslaved. Third, in black majority societies in which white folks were massively outnumbered. Fourth, in colonies facing external attack from foreign powers like France, Spain, or Britain. Fifth, in economies that are suffering through depressions or recessions. Sixth, in urban environments in which enslaved people might be more readily exposed to ideas and information from elsewhere. 7. In geographies where would-be fugitives had nowhere to run. 8th, in geographies proximate to significant maroon communities, and the word maroon refers to people slaves who have run away, and usually into the forest or the swamp. 9. Amid rumors that local slaveholders had failed to implement some distant central government's decision to abolish slavery throughout its empire. 10. In societies in which master absenteeism was common and the master-slave relationship was estranged and depersonalized. 11. In societies in which the slave-holding regime permitted the emergence of an autonomous black leadership. Obviously, these 11 preconditions are sometimes mutually exclusive, and Geggus suggests that major New World slave insurrections have occurred when only a handful of these 11 preconditions have been met. The 1739 Stono Revolt, for instance, occurred in the context in which only the 2nd, third, and fourth conditions were truly operative. By David Geggis's measure, Brazil, Cuba, and certain other Caribbean islands were the most natural breeding grounds for massive slave revolts. Indeed, truly significant conspiracies were discovered there every 2 years between 1731 and 1823. That shouldn't surprise us. The average plantation estate in Brazil, for instance, employed 100 slaves. In the Caribbean, that number was 150. By contrast, plantations on the North American mainland tended to be much smaller, averaging just 20 enslaved laborers in the 18th century, most of whom were, by the mid-18th century, far more likely to have been born here than been born in Africa and kidnapped and enslaved. This sort of comparative New World thinking should make clear some of the many impediments to staging a successful slave revolt in the colonies that would become the United States. But that is not the full extent of it. In David Geggis's reckoning, there are other circumstantial obstacles to insurrection, namely atomization, the idea that enslaved individuals on a given plantation have little blood, family, language, or culture in common with one another. Or self-debasement, the idea that enslaved people internalize their master's view of them as inferior, childlike, and incapable of assertive personhood. Or military inferiority, the conviction among would-be rebels that they lack access to arms numerous and sophisticated enough to challenge their oppressors. Or unfamiliarity with freedom, the idea that people born into slavery cannot fully comprehend the prospect of a life in liberty. Or obedience to Christianity, the belief among enslaved converts that the Christian Bible teaches duty and loyalty rather than revolution. Given the obstacles ranged against them, and the very real possibility that there were informers, spies, and traitors among them, it is remarkable that any American slave making a rational appraisal of the costs of resistance ever decided to resist at all. You might interpret such reticence as cowardice or a lack of conviction, but the relative lack of slave revolts in colonial British America might also represent a conscious effort to develop some alternative strategies for survival. While events like the 1739 Stono Rebellion focus our attention on the southern colonies of the mainland, like South Carolina, it's nonetheless true that slavery was also an important economic institution in many northern colonies in the 18th century. In fact, in 1741, just 2 years after Stono, white New Yorkers actually thought that they'd discovered a slave plot in their city, a plot to burn down Manhattan's houses, rape its white women, and kill its white masters. By the 1740s, slaves made up almost 20% of the population of New York. The colony had passed at least 5 sets of slave codes, too, each one designed to deter the city's slaves from coming together and rebelling. One reason that white New Yorkers passed so many slave codes in the first few decades of the 18th century was that a slave conspiracy had been discovered in that city once already. In 1712, 25 enslaved men and women, originally from Ghana, had set fire to barns and outhouses on the edge of the city. When neighbors arrived to put out the blaze, these slaves had attacked those white neighbors with guns, axes, and swords, and killed or wounded 20 of them. As these rebel slaves tried to flee New York City, they had been captured, and then, after some cursory trials, 18 of these conspirators were executed. To deter any other slaves in the city from imitating these rebel arsonists, the city leaders displayed the heads of the executed slaves on spikes all around Manhattan. So in 1712, white New Yorkers had had their worst fears realized. Their brutal treatment of those conspirators and the slave codes they passed in the years that followed the 1712 plot shows just how anxious they and their descendants were that their city escape any further slave revolts. The memories of those decomposing heads from the 1712 rebellion served to deter any more of the city's slaves from armed rebellion for the next 30 years, But those deterrents didn't last forever. In 1741, authorities in New York uncovered a second slave conspiracy in their city, this time apparently intended to burn the whole city down to the ground and kill all slave-owning whites. In fear of their lives, white officials responded to the discovery of this supposed plot with a series of trials that sent many city slaves to their deaths. Over several months in 1741, more than 150 slaves and their suspected accomplices were indicted and charged with burglary, arson, and conspiracy to rebel. 31 enslaved people would be executed before this hysteria ended. Let's start by laying out what the white authorities thought they had discovered. The year 1741 began with the burglary of a shop in Manhattan, from which some gold coins were taken. The city's sheriff soon got a tip from an informant that the thieves were two slaves, named Caesar Varick and Prince Aboino. When the sheriff arrested these two enslaved men for burglary, both of them denied it. So next the sheriff questioned the keeper of a tavern where both Varick and Aboino were known to spend most of their time. This tavern, John Hewson's Tavern, was well known as being a sort of speakeasy for slaves, a place where enslaved men and women could drink, gamble, and meet prostitutes, all illegally, by the way. And so it seemed to the New York sheriff that it was pretty likely that John Hewson, even though he was white, was in on the plan to rob these local shops, and that he had probably offered to fence and sell on any goods that these slaves stole during the burglaries. When the sheriff interviewed the staff at John Hewson's Tavern, one of the servants, a 16-year-old white girl named Mary Burton, began to sing like a canary, telling the sheriff that she had seen the slaves and her boss, the tavern keeper John Hewson, plotting together. Plotting not just a few burglaries here and there, but devising a much larger plot that they were about to set into motion. According to Mary Burton, the slaves' plan was to enlist accomplices to start a great number of fires all across New York City to distract white residents while the black slaves robbed their homes. And that's exactly what happened next. Before anyone could be arrested for conspiring to commit these crimes, the fires began, just as Mary had predicted. On March the 18th, 1741, someone started a fire on the roof of the city's fort, Fort George. The fire soon spread next door and began to consume the governor's mansion, the chapel, and the armory. When the raging fire was eventually put out, eyewitnesses told the sheriff that they'd seen a slave named Quacko Roosevelt start that fire. It was beginning to seem as if Varick and Prince's plot to set fires while robbing homes was becoming a reality. In the next few weeks, more and more fires hit the city, 13 in all. As the number of fires multiplied, white residents began to panic. On April 6th, city leaders met to try to get to the bottom of the rumors and to calm the increasing hysteria of the city's white residents. They agreed to beef up the night watch and issued a warrant to allow the sheriff to search all slave dwellings to look for stolen goods and perhaps find evidence of fire starting. But these searches turned up absolutely nothing, and so the city council met again. This time it agreed to offer a reward of up to £100, a huge amount of money in 1741, to any free person who could supply information about this suspected arson conspiracy among the city's slaves. This reward, this mountain of cash, got Mary Burton's attention. The young servant at John Hewson's Tavern had already accused Caesar Varick and Prince Aboino of stealing the gold coins, and now, with her eyes on this £100 reward, she suddenly had more to say. She now claimed to have overheard meetings at Hewson's Tavern, at which Varick, Prince, and other city slaves talked not just of small fires and burglaries, but of burning down the fort and burning down the whole city. She now claimed that John Hewson had offered to do whatever he could to help them with this arson plot. She now claimed to have heard Caesar Varick boasting that when the slaves finally rose up, that he would be the governor of this whole city, and that Hewson would be its king. She now claimed that Prince and Varick and Hewson had laid plans to murder as many whites as they could in the confusion caused by their fires. And she even claimed that Prince and Varick had at least 30 slaves ready to help them, and that these 30 accomplices had gotten hold of guns and swords and were ready to attack. This avalanche of new information provided the context in which Caesar Varick and Prince Aboino arrived in court to face charges for the burglary that had first focused attention on what the city's slaves were getting up to. Because of colonial two-strike laws, and because they'd both been prosecuted for robberies before, they were now facing the death penalty for this repeat offense. Both men pleaded not guilty to the burglary charges, and when questioned about the existence of a slave conspiracy in the city, they said nothing. It didn't matter. To try to make an example of these two slaves, the court in New York quickly found both of them guilty of the original thefts and sentenced them both to death. They hanged on May the 11th, 1741. With two of the suspected conspirators now executed, albeit for burglary, New York prosecutors next turned to the other people they suspected of conspiring. The sheriff began rounding up all the black accomplices that Mary Burton had named in her affidavit, and soon the jail cells at City Hall were bulging with dozens of slaves. The first trials for actual conspiracy followed soon afterwards. First in the dock were Quacko Roosevelt, the slave seen fleeing the scene of the fire at Fort George, and another man believed to have conspired to burn the city to the ground. The charge was arson, and wickedly, voluntarily, feloniously, and maliciously conspiring, combining, and confederating with diverse other Negroes to kill and murder the inhabitants of this city. It was hardly a fair trial. Listen to the hostility in the voice of the prosecution lawyer during his closing statement to the jury. Gentlemen, no scheme more monstrous could have been invented, nor can anything be thought of more foolish than the motives that induced these wretches to enter into it. What more ridiculous than Hewson, in consequence of this scheme, should become a king? Caesar, a governor? That the white men should all be killed, and the women become a prey to the rapacious lust of these villains? That these slaves should thereby establish themselves in peace and freedom in the plundered wealth of their slaughtered masters? 'Tis hard to say whether the wickedness or the folly of this design is the greater. And had it not been in part executed before it was discovered, we should with great difficulty have been persuaded to believe it possible, that such a wicked and foolish plot could be contrived by any creatures in human shape. The jury at these trials clearly agreed, because they handed down guilty verdicts for both Quacko and his associate Cuffy. Both men were burned at the stake. Unfortunately, their deaths did not bring this witch hunt to an end. Throughout June and July, city authorities continued to prosecute those they believed had played a part in planning this conspiracy. A conspiracy, remember, that had never really been carried out. In fact, the investigation now expanded to consider suspicions that it was all a plot by a Spanish priest named John Uri, recently arrived in the city, to create anarchy and give Catholic Spain an advantage in its ongoing war with England and its colonies. Conveniently, Mary Burton now suddenly remembered that this Catholic priest John Uri had been a ringleader, and her testimony sent Uri to the gallows. John Hewson, the tavern keeper, was also executed for conspiracy on June 11th, along with his wife. But still the court was not finished. On the same day that it passed down Hewson's death sentence, it named the next 6 slaves that it would try on charges of conspiracy. By now, the slaves, locked in the jail cells beneath City Hall, were ready to confess to pretty much anything to avoid being hanged or burned at the stake. Daniel Horsmanden, the judge who presided over some of these trials, told his diary, "Now the Negroes begin to squeak." Most of the confessions that now poured forth from slave prisoners during June and July shared some common elements that suggest that any plot that had existed was not, in fact, as organized or as deliberate as the judges and investigators had feared. Prisoners making these confessions described gatherings of slaves that occurred by accident rather than by design. They spoke of rumors they'd heard, rather than carefully worked out plans of which they were a part. They claimed casual acquaintance with one another, rather than premeditated membership in a conspirator's circle. In return for their confession, the court did spare their lives, punishing them instead by transporting them out of the New York colony to be sold into slavery abroad. The vagueness of their confessions helped to calm the hysteria in the city. By the end of the summer, the executions had largely ceased. In total, 70 slaves were sold and sent away, mostly to faraway places like Jamaica. 4 white people were executed, 18 enslaved people were hanged, and 13 more were burned at the stake. While a minority of those accused of conspiracy were probably guilty of meeting together to make some sort of plot, the majority of those accused were surely not guilty. As in the Salem witch trials of 1692, paranoia, fear, and hysteria were the real conspirators, widening the circle of accusation until it included far more people than could have ever likely been involved in a genuine plot. The scale of these events in South Carolina in 1739 and in New York in 1741 were exceptional in the history of colonial British North America. Every other rumor of a mass insurrection on the mainland came to nothing. But that would soon change. Within a generation, within 30 years, the onset of the American Revolution in the 1770s would bring enslaved people in New York, in South Carolina, and everywhere else in British North America a new raft of opportunities for flight, rebellion, and collective revolt against the slave system that tens of thousands of men, women, and children would seize with both hands. That's all I have to say. Thank you very much.